Hello, this is my second video about the Kakhovka Dam. I started making a video yesterday, realised it was going to get too long and decided to divide it up into the various issues and variables. So the first one was on the ecological issues. The second one, this one, is the whodunit. I've already uploaded the first one, so it's there. I'll leave a link in the description. That's the one about the ecology. Okay, so what about the second one, which is whodunit? Now, before I get onto that, I'll tell you I'm Granniopteryx. I'm on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds, also on Twitter and Gab. I let you know when I've uploaded new videos on Twitter and Gab, but all the links are in the description. Also the links to donations if you want, but the best you can do is hit that like button, share and subscribe. Right, before I get on to the main point of my argument, I want to clear up a couple of issues arising from the previous video. I had a few comments about my mentioning oil in the water. Look, I'm not an engineer, don't pretend to be, but almost all of the sources that I looked at talked about a lot of oil in the water. Now, certainly the turbines would need to be lubricated and they'd probably have a continuous spray of oil on them, and that would mean there'd have to be a large tank of oil to do that spraying. A very large tank probably. There are several turbines, and since delivering is difficult in that area, I'm sure they would have had a large capacity. And then there's the other possibility. For instance, it gets very cold there in the winter. There's a very good chance that some of the water might actually freeze. So I can imagine that these machines would have some sort of a backup system to stop them seizing up when the water around them was freezing, or to heat warm water so that it didn't freeze as it went through the turbines. This would require petroleum of some description, diesel, I don't know what, but you see what I mean. And there would probably have been a store of that at all. But if anybody is a dam engineer who's watching this, let me know. I wasn't swearing at you just then. So that's it. Yeah, oil in the water seems to be something of an issue. Where it comes from, well, perhaps you can tell me. The second thing from the comments was really very funny, very amusing. In all this bleakness, it warmed the cockles of my heart, because I kept getting bots, or people, obviously, with the intelligence of a bot, walking straight into this huge elephant trap. I mean, it might as well have had a neon sign over it saying elephant trap, 20 feet high, because what they kept saying was, and what about the Dam Busters raid? Now, the Dam Busters raid was a reference to the operation mounted by the Royal Air Force using a newly invented bomb during the Second World War. It bounced like a coin flipped across the surface of the water. These bombs bounced and smashed into the three related dams in the Ruhr Valley. Not one bomb, by the way, several raids, a wave of raids and several bombs. But yeah, all the same design. And they were very successful in destroying these dams. This was supposed to disrupt German production of armaments in the factories in that area. I can imagine these human Russian bots feeling great satisfaction as they slam down their gotcha, and probably with something of a flourish hit send or post or whatever, and then felt like they'd really achieved something. The only problem with that is that I didn't blame anyone for that in the ecological one. I was talking only about the ecological effects. I didn't point the finger at anybody. So what these comments were saying was that they really thought that the Russians had done it and were going straight in on the justification angle. How stupid can a Russian bot be? Well, rather spectacularly stupid by that metric. Okay, so what about this bouncing bomb thing? It was called Operation Chastise, by the way. Well, I'm not going to go into it in great detail. Sorry, I'm coughing rather a lot. I have other fish to fry, so to speak, if any fish have survived this calamity. But the rules of war do have it that dams are a legitimate target. And I'm interrupting myself to tell you something here because I was wrong. According to the information I had before, dams were a legitimate target up to 1949 when the rules were changed. And now places like electricity stations and dams are strictly off the board when it comes to fighting wars. So if the Russians did it, it would be a war crime. Indeed, if the Ukrainians did it, it would be a war crime too. So any future reference I might make during this video, remember, if anybody destroyed the dam deliberately as an act of war, that's a war crime. And that's why I think towards the end of the video, I come up with another theory, and that's probably why it was done. That only strengthens the theory I had, but you'll have to wait till the end to find out what it was. But you might look at some caveats to this, and let's have a look at the map again. You see, this is the reservoir, the backed up water. This is the river. Here's the bridge. Well, not bridge. Here's the non-dam, the ex-dam now. And here is the outlet to the sea. This, as you will see from this map, is quite high ground, but down here it's very low-lying land, and it has now been, well, literally swamped. This bit is Kherson. That is, it is Russian territory. So that means that if the Russians did it, they would be swamping not only their own territory, but their own people completely without warning, without telling anyone. Even the mayor of Kherson didn't realise that this had happened for several hours. So the Russians could be considered guilty of murdering their own citizens. And the second thing is, when the British attacked the Ruhr dams, the effects were felt only by the Ruhr Valley, that is, German factories in a German part of the world. In the case of Nova Kakhovka, the effects will be felt by all the non-combatant countries. Let's have a look at this. All the non-combatant countries surrounding the Black Sea. So let's see, there's Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Georgia here, Armenia there, and this bit is actually Russia. So all of this will get the contamination of whatever's brought down here. And if you think that looks like a little river, it isn't. And oil, if there's oil, as has been said, then that will be fetching up all over the place. And if it comes through here and gets out into the Mediterranean, it will also be contaminating Greece and more of Turkey and Sardinia and Cyprus, and possibly even North Africa and Israel, Lebanon, Syria, you know, all these places, possibly. But certainly round here in the Black Sea. So what the Russians were doing was damaging the environment, not only of an enemy, and not that much because they're not so much affected, but also completely non-combatant countries that get caught in the crossfire here. I'd say that made a big difference to the whataboutery. Now, so let's get on to who did it. Well, so far, not even the bots have announced that it was the Americans what done it. So let's just stick with the two principal suspects, the Ukrainians or the Russians. And the obvious place to start, of course, is cui bono. Who benefits? Well, let's start with Ukraine, because to a certain extent you could make the argument that they do benefit from this. First of all, they might be forestalling a Russian invasion from Kherson. The ground was drying out, it was becoming suitable for tanks. The Russians knew where all the mines were, so perhaps they were thinking, they could have been thinking, well, we'll stop the Russians from coming in while we're attacking over here. That's the first thing. And again, as I said, the Russians have mined this area, so would flooding disrupt the mines? I don't know. Would mines survive being submerged? I'm not sure. It would certainly disrupt the other measures that the Russians have constructed. Yeah, well, it's an argument. That's about it. I can't think of any other benefits the Ukrainians could have got from this disaster. And of course, they say this is their land, and this land is going to dry out pretty quickly without the canals. And of course, there's also the nuclear power station up here, which might suffer some damage because the cooling water is in slightly unreliable supply. Okay, so I'd say the argument for Ukraine doing it is quite weak. It's not impossible, but it's quite weak. So what's in it for the Russians? Well, first of all, it will divert Ukrainian resources, the sort of resources they might have used for attack, to search and rescue. And some of you obviously think that the Ukrainians are worse than the Russians and wouldn't bother about, which means that they wouldn't bother about their own citizens any more than the Russians would. But let's face it, the press is there, the world's press, they're all there. If the Ukrainians were ignoring their people, they'd be reporting on that. So the Ukrainians would have to do that whether they were worse than the Russians or not. Okay, now, as I said before, turning the land to swamp is not a good idea for tanks. So wherever the Ukrainians choose to start their counter-offensive, there's a low chance it will be here now. Okay, what's next for the Russians? Well, of course, it's going to protect Crimea, isn't it? If the Ukrainians can't get across this piece here, then they can't get into Crimea. And we all know that Crimea is Putin's baby. And if Crimea goes, he goes. Now, most people in Europe are of the opinion that it was the Russians, including the bots who were trying to get at me in the last video. And I do believe it was the Russians as well, although maybe not quite in the way that some people have said. I understand, though, that America is not so sure, that opinion is more divided. But you guys in the USA, I have to point something out. Perhaps we in Europe know a bit more about Russia than you do, especially the East Europeans and the Germans who had the pleasure of hosting them in the 1940s. So, on the question of who benefits from this, I'd say there are more arguments that the Russians benefit. They're going to know that if the Ukrainians can't come here, they're going to have to come further up here. You know, they couldn't cross here, it's much too wide. I mean, that's miles wide. It's as big as some of the Great Lakes. So they'd have to come further north. Well, getting down here, they'd have to fight their way all the way down here. So the Russians can concentrate their forces here. Yeah, it's just more predictable, isn't it? Sorry, still coughing. So look, now I've given you some reasons why I think the Russians, there's more of an argument for the Russians having done this than the Ukrainians. Now I shall talk a little bit about national characteristics, because we have to consider the defensive habits of the Russians, which they haven't quite got out of. If you look at European history, I mean Western European history, you will see there is a history of castles. And that's because the lords, having taken possession of certain parts of land, have built themselves great stone fortresses where they can withstand a siege from invaders. Now, these fortresses were not just little towers for themselves. They were, there was the tower in the middle, the keep, where the safest part of the castle, but round it there was usually a huge area which furnished a place where the peasants could go, the surrounding peasants could take refuge. Because if they survived the siege, that lord still needed the peasants. So to a certain extent their safety and the safety of the food animals they had was important. And that's why they built these stone castles to withstand invasions. Russia had a different attitude. Everything was built of wood. Very few stone castles at all. I can't think of any. And the defensive tactic they chose was, whenever there's an invasion, to burn everything down, thus denying the invading armies the food and the resources that the capture of a city would give them. The peasants, well, they're left to starve along with everything else, while the lords just disappear for a while and wait for the area to become safe again. European aristocracy might not have had a great attitude to the peasants, but that was nothing next to the Russian aristocratic attitude to their serfs. So, in my opinion, according to the information I've been able to put together, whodunnit, it was the Russians. Now, like Miss Marple, do I expect President Putin to jump out of his chair and say, yes, I did it, I tell you, I hate you all. And then before he jumps out of the window to the sounds of an awful scream and a sickening thud. No, I expect the Russians to deny it to the very end. So, bearing in mind that my next video will be Whodunnit, I shall instead leave you with this little clip from Jordan Peterson.
Here's what you should have done if you were a Nazi and you wanted to win the war. You should have enslaved the Jews and the Gypsies and had them work, right? You should have had them work for the benefit of the victory. And then if you wanted to, you liquidate them afterwards. That's the logical thing to do if you want to win. And we assume that Hitler wanted to win. But that's not a very intelligent assumption. Why would you assume that? He wasn't exactly a good guy. So why should we assume that he was aiming at the good that he was promoting, even in his own terms, right? The glorious, everlasting Third Reich, right? That'll rule for 1,000 years and be a bastion of civilization and music, because that's the sort of thing he purported to be interested in. Well, so what do you do with the Jews and the Gypsies? Well, round them up, fine. Enslave them, fine. You don't kill them. You certainly don't devote a substantial proportion of your war resources while you're losing to accelerate the rate at which the extermination is taking place, because that's a bit counterproductive, unless what you're aiming at is the maximum possible mayhem in the shortest period of time. Well, so what happened as the Germans started to lose the war? Did Hitler lose faith in his own ability? No, he believed that the Germans had betrayed him with weakness, and so he was perfectly willing to accelerate the rate at which Germany was losing the war. And so when Hitler and his minions had the choice, here's the choice. You can suspend your unnecessary demolition of people, win the damn war, and then pick it up afterwards. Or, while you're losing, you can just accelerate the mayhem, even though it's counterproductive. It's like, what'd they pick? Well, they picked to accelerate the mayhem. And so, to me, there's an old psychoanalytic idea. I think this was derived by Jung. If you can't figure out what someone is doing or why, look at the outcome and infer the motivation. If it produces mayhem, perhaps it was aiming at mayhem.
Okay. Till next time. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the granniopteryx design or Granbo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.granniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.